Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters and friends, hopefully people that will continue to grow into part of the extended family. I am Paul DeBarth. I am delighted to be the host of Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum. And tonight we are introducing Kyle Walker, the author of several books about the Joseph Smith Sr. family. And I've hoped that he would be available to talk with us about several topics, but tonight I hope that he would address us largely on the remarkable book about William Smith, who was the last surviving son of the Joseph Sr. and Lucy Mack Smith marriage. But I think he'll probably be open to questions and comments beyond that. He did his dissertation on the Joseph and Lucy Mack Smith family and has followed with a compelling biography of William Smith, their son. And while he has tiptoed around the abolitionist tendencies of the family, he has provided substantial inferential information of the Richardsons in Palestine Grove and William's association with Isaac Sheen to whet our appetites for this presentation this evening. And so clearly I'm setting the background here for one of the more important questions that I want to ask. But we'll save that for after he presents, and let me ask you to join me in prayer. Progenitor of all we see and hear, and an infinitely beyond, the proprietor of everything we claim, having created the earth as holy ground. We bow in recognition of our ineptitude, our misplaced claims to power, land, and empire, to listen for a little bit to your silence, in which we hear the thunder, the glissando of your eternal choir. And we open our hands to admit that what we hold for ourselves as ours is really yours. Even the perspiration oozing, dripping, pouring from our pores. Water, which mixes back to give life, love, hydrogen and oxygen to you in its essence, is but an extrapolation, a synthesis, an embodiment of your presence. And we crave the water in the heart and the heat of our day. We crave to quench the thirst brought on by our dehydration. But a symbol of your living water, ill-used by us, yet needed desperately in the eternal rehydration. We seek your blessing this evening on our presenter, Kyle Walker, as we discuss the legacy of the Smith family, and pray that our participants be open to your message within his homily. And this we ask in the name of Jesus the Christ. Amen. All right, I will stop sharing, and Kyle, I welcome you. I would encourage people to defer questions until he's had a chance to present. But as usual, we commonly have an hour or so of questions and answers afterwards. And so the floor is yours, Kyle, if you'd like to share with us, please.
Okay, thank you. I see many friends. It's great to be with you tonight. Yeah, I've been researching William Smith probably since, I don't know, for probably 20 years now or more. I had done a collection of essays that I edited on the Smith family that I published in 2006. And I had done the essays on William Smith and knew that there was a lot more information out there on William Smith. And I also did a chapter on Catherine Smith Salisbury. So I just mentioned her, that I've just submitted a manuscript full-length biography on Catherine Smith Salisbury, Joseph Smith's sister, just this last month. So that will be forthcoming. A longtime member of the RLDS Church until her death in 1900. So that's been a related biography that I've just recently completed. I think I'll start by just giving some highlights of William Smith's life for those that may be less familiar with his role in the early church. William's younger brother, the younger brother of Joseph Smith, born in 1811. He and Catherine were closest in age. He was 9 in 1820. around the time Joseph Smith reported his first vision, and age 12, when Joseph said that Moroni's first visits occurred. So kind of a budding youth, the 1820s, in his teenage years, prior to the organization of the Church of Christ. He was the last person in the family to really formally unite with the Church of Christ. And in his own memoir, he indicates that he was still wild and inconsiderate about religious matters, even though he never doubted Joseph Smith's accounts of his visions. He had a lot to say. Both he and Catherine lived the longest in the family. I think William died at 1893, and Catherine in 1900. And so because of their affiliation also with the RLDS Church, a lot of letters have survived, and they were interviewed a number of times, and that's provided a lot of valuable information as to their recollections, even though they were late. He left a number of accounts of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. A couple of tidbits that might be of interest to you. He highlighted the role of the Reverend George Lane more than any other person. Oliver Cowdery mentions George Lane in one account, but William Smith gets into details about the effectiveness of George Lane as a preacher in the Palmyra vicinity and beyond. In fact, even gets specific in one account where he says that the Reverend George Lane preached a sermon on James 1:5. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God. And that was at least part of the reason that Joseph Smith went into the woods seeking an answer to his prayer, was because of George Lane's sermon. He also said that he hefted the plates while covered. Is something that Catherine also recounts on several occasions, of hefting those plates, moving the plates around the house on several occasions. And much like Emma Smith recorded, rustling her finger across the metal pages and hearing the tinkling of the sound of the pages beneath that covered cloth. And so several family members leave that account, as well as Emma Smith, which I thought was interesting. William had a disposition that was fairly difficult. He had a temper. My training is as a mental health professional, and I was drawn to William because I saw some psychological elements that I thought were pretty interesting. And he had a temper. He tussles with Joseph in Kirtland, if you'll recall, and disagreed with him about some ecclesiastical decisions, and didn't always deal mildly with those disagreements, and one time physically attacked Joseph. And Joseph recorded in his journal that he could neither sit nor stand without assistance for several days after that tussle. William, I was able to document a number of instances where he used his strength to get his way throughout his life. When he's living later in Plymouth, Illinois, I believe that's in the southern part of Hancock County, Illinois, he gets in a fight there. And later in life, when he's forming his own church, he also gets into several fisticuffs with some of the local residents. So there seems to be a little bit of a pattern of behavior, somewhat impulsive and inconstant in his membership oftentimes. So he's an original member of the Quorum of the 12, and that came after some debate when they were trying to choose the Quorum of the 12. Oliver Cowdery had chosen Phineas Young, Brigham Young's brother, to be a member of the Quorum of the 12, and Joseph Smith insists that William Smith be put into the Quorum of the 12, that it was necessary for his salvation. And so they finally acquiesce, and William Smith is put in as a member of the Quorum of the 12, and almost immediately has challenges in that role. But part of the reason I wanted to write the biography is that William had a lot of wonderful talents. He was a great preacher. People were drawn to William. He was charismatic. He was very good looking. We think that there's a Maudsley painting. I don't have this in the PowerPoint, but this is in a book on Sutcliffe Maudsley's paintings. Maybe I can just show it if you can see it. This is a painting of William Smith, we believe is William Smith, and his wife Caroline Grant. It was unlabeled, but good looking, blue eyes, over 6 feet tall, and a great preacher. Has great success as a missionary, laboring in the East, served a number of missions. In the 1840s, William is basically serving as the president of the eastern branches of the church. And so he's overseeing all the leadership on the eastern seaboard. And he and a fellow named Sam Brannan, if you recall him, later of the Gold Rush fame, is serving with him, and George J. Adams, if you'll remember him. That's quite a trio of characters that are serving as kind of this unofficial presidency in the eastern branches. And they caused a lot of turmoil while they're back there. Introduced plural marriage in that area without sanction from leaders at Nauvoo. And later, when that gets back to leaders at Nauvoo, they're pretty upset with William. So during the time Joseph and Hiram are killed in Carthage, William Smith is in the east. His wife has a condition called dropsy, edema, and she would swell, and she would have to be what they call tapped, where they would drain this fluid from her stomach on numerous occasions. Sounds like a horrible procedure in the mid 1800s. And so he remains in the east for almost a year after Joseph and Hiram are killed. And I think that's a significant factor. Eventually, Parley P. Pratt, one of his fellow Quorum of the 12, comes to New York. Wilford Woodruff goes through New York on his way to Europe for a mission. And they both write accounts to Brigham Young about their concerns about William Smith's leadership in the East. And so eventually Brigham Young appoints Parley P. Pratt to supplant William Smith in the East. And William Smith is astute enough to know what's going on. And so by the time he gets back to Nauvoo, his wife is barely making it. In fact, she'll die 3 weeks later in Nauvoo, but he's seething from being replaced as the leader in the East. And there's some interesting accounts in the church records of him kind of going back and forth with Brigham Young and other members of the Quorum of the 12 about his authority and what his authority is to be able to perform plural marriages or sealings, and that he needs to be accountable to Brigham Young. So they kind of go back and forth once he's back in Nauvoo. They offer kind of I guess a peace offering, because William wants the patriarchal office, which leaders had written to him about and said you're entitled to. And so they ordain him the day after his wife's funeral. I believe it was, maybe even the day of, later in the day after her funeral, he's ordained a patriarch to the church. And almost immediately he begins to expand upon what that office meant and what that entitled him to. I think William wanted an office that was similar to what Hiram Smith had before his death. So not just a patriarch, but also almost like a co-counselor or a co-president in the church. And so you've got these editorials being sent to the Times and Seasons, where William Smith sends a letter, and then some of the Quorum of the 12, John Taylor, Willard Richards, others writing, saying, no, that's not what the office entails. And they're sort of doing this back and forth thing. It's a turbulent summer for William. You could almost write a book about the summer of 1845 on William Smith and all that transpired in that turbulent summer. I don't know how much to go into, but there's the patriarchal office. Some of the police in Nauvoo get frustrated with William. He eventually beats up the head of police, Eldridge Tufts, and loses their protection. It's a precarious time in Nauvoo, obviously, for the Saints. And so William has 2 daughters he's trying to take care of. He marries in Nauvoo. He's even brash enough that in August, he publicly preaches a sermon on plural marriage in Nauvoo. And I believe that when he did that, he lost Emma Smith's support. That before that, they had had conversations, according to several letters, about how to reform the church, according to William. And that he had spent a lot of time with Emma discussing that, apparently, again, according to William, not according to Emma. And he eventually writes her and realizes he's lost her support, and is pretty frustrated with that. He eventually makes I think, a significant decision to leave Nauvoo. And he's warned, at least he feels like he's warned, that his life is in jeopardy if he doesn't leave. His brother-in-law, Catherine's husband, Jenkins, also feels like his life is in jeopardy. And so they flee Nauvoo in the dead of night in September of 1845. And it's like William's kind of vacillating between, should I run or should I return to the safety of Nauvoo? And I think he's on the fence. He writes a really detailed, lengthy letter to Brigham Young, expressing his loyalty and that I just needed to get away for a bit, when all the while he's already met up with George J. Adams, and they are beginning to talk reforming the church. But I think that's kind of a critical moment for him. And eventually he splits. He goes with George J. Adams, and he goes north to, I believe it's Galena, Illinois. And he publishes this proclamation, which he sends to newspapers throughout the state, exposing polygamy, talking about Brigham Young and Parley P. Pratt and John Taylor and others whom he had clashed with that summer. And he even sends some of these pamphlets that he produces. He sends one to Thomas Sharp down in Warsaw, whom he had tussled with earlier with his newspaper. But anyway, he sends, and Thomas Sharp is one who's accused of the assassination of Joseph and Hiram Smith, but he sends him his pamphlet, and Thomas Sharp's just elated to receive this pamphlet denouncing the 12 at Nauvoo, and he publishes it on the front page of his newspaper. And once that reaches Nauvoo, then William Smith is excommunicated in October of 1845. He will eventually go to St. Louis and later to Cincinnati, and tries to start to form a church at St. Louis initially, gather up some of the saints there. He's probably got less than 20 followers at that time. He leaves his brother-in-law, Jenkins Salisbury, in charge of a branch there, those 20 members, and he moves to Ohio for a time. And while he's there, he learns about James J. Strang. And he starts to be convinced of James J. Strang and his mission. And so eventually he'll return to Nauvoo. I think that's March 1846 that he returns to Nauvoo, picks up Jenkins Salisbury in St. Louis, comes to Nauvoo right after Brigham Young and the Saints are headed west. And I think he had his eye on property there in Nauvoo, hoping to gather up some of that property and make some money. But he begins writing James J. Strang. He tries to get the support of his family, although family members later deny that they supported Strang. But at the time, there's some different accounts of that in Nauvoo. But certainly William does, and he's kind of jockeying for position with Strang, and Strang will appoint him as patriarch. I think he appoints him in the first presidency as well for a time. And eventually he'll go to Vori, where he's ordained to those offices. And we'll spend, I think it's about a year maybe, with James J. Strang and his organization. I think he goes to Kirtland for a time on a mission, promoting Strang. But eventually the two split. Without going into too many details, they split, and William Smith comes back and eventually will try to form his own church. It's interesting, just going back a little bit, when he was at St. Louis, William begins for the first time to kind of promote lineal succession, that this should stay in the Smith family, that Joseph Smith III would be the eventual successor of his father, but I will be the pro tem president until that time. And so he begins to promote that in St. Louis. That's the earliest point I can document William Smith saying that, was in St. Louis. And then he shelves that for a time when he goes with Strang, but picks up that idea again in about 1847, and eventually forms a church. And this is kind of interesting. He forms his church up near Amboy, Illinois. And that's where his headquarters will be. It was called Palestine Grove at the time. And he will gather up a number of notable figures that will later play into the formation of the RLDS Church. So he's got W.W. Blair following him. He's got Jason Briggs. He's got Zenas Gurley that are following William Smith and his church in Palestine Grove. And I believe, as I've looked at the documents, that William kind of lays the groundwork here for lineal succession during that time. He's publishing some newspapers. It's not a consistent newspaper. He's using other people's press to do that, other newspaper presses, to promote his ideas. But he's gathering, a decent following in the years 1847 to 1851 or so in Palestine Grove, and has some success there. I would say at its peak, he's probably got about 60 to 80 members there in that area, but he has much more up in southern Wisconsin, including Briggs' group and Gurley's group that are supporting his leadership. Eventually, he introduces polygamy, and things fall apart when people start to discover that he's introducing polygamy to some of his closest followers at Palestine Grove. Runs into legal trouble surrounding that, and eventually leaves the area about 1852, 1853, kind of run out of town, has some lawsuits, and that's kind of the end of his church in that area. I don't know how much details you want to know going into his later life, or if we should pause and just do some Q&A at this point, if that would be more helpful for folks. But eventually William kind of settles down, marries Eliza Sanborn in Kirtland, Ohio, and comes back and settles in northeastern Iowa, kind of far away from his earlier exploits, and is a respected citizen in northeastern Iowa. And everything you read about him in later life, it's like he settles down, his children, and he raises his children by Eliza. They have great admiration for their father. He's a respected citizen in town. Eventually, he starts to go back and forth with Joseph Smith III, petitioning to join the RLDS Church. I believe that's 1878. And eventually they kind of come to terms, negotiating what his role would be in the church. And he joins as a lay member. I think he wanted to be installed as the patriarch, and Joseph Smith III is very careful about not extending that to him. But he does serve several missions for the RLDS Church as an older man. And and promotes the RLDS Church until his death in 1893. One other interesting tidbit about William Smith is that he served in the Civil War. Misstated his age to make him appear 10 years younger, but he serves down in Arkansas. And that's kind of a little known chapter that I included in the book on his service in the Civil War. So that gives you some highlights about William Smith, a little bit about his life. And I'd be happy to answer questions you might have. We can talk a little bit about any aspects of his life that you might want to discuss. I don't know what the typical format is, but is that okay?
Yes, that's fine. But I commonly get to ask the first question as a privileged host.
Okay.
And I want to take you back to my introduction, because to me, where you talked about him talking about polygamy as an issue that got him in confrontation with Brigham Young. Well, as I read your book, I became highly suspicious that his baptizing and ordaining African-American men to the priesthood is particularly offensive to people like Woodruff and Pratt, and that may very well have been a very significant factor in why he and Brigham Young did not get along, and where sort of a hidden background factor for his ultimate excommunication.
Yeah, I didn't find any evidence of that. It could be. I think Appleby, one of the leaders in the East, does say some things about that. William Appleby, about him ordaining Joseph T. Ball, I think it was, in the East. He's pretty progressive in extending priesthood to some of the early Black saints. He ordains Q. Walker Lewis to the office of an elder.
Right.
In November 1844, he ordains Joseph T. Ball as a high priest and installs him as the president of the branch at Boston while he's serving in the East. So, and then he lives with Elijah Abels, Marianne Abels in Ohio for a time. And so it appears to me that he had pretty strong abolitionist roots. And yeah, it seems that way. And I would say for the whole Smith family, there seems to be that. I make a little case for Catherine in my book of, let me just read a section of my book from Catherine, just this part on abolitionist sentiment. This is what Catherine said. See if I can find it here. Her recollection, she's kind of reflecting on Missouri. She says, most of the saints were persons of education and refinement from the best New York and New England families, and were people of progressive ideas and strong anti-slavery sentiments. She went so far as to describe the saints as, quote, New England abolitionists, mortal enemies to, which stance, if true, obviously conflicted with her Missouri neighbors, whom Catherine described as being mortal enemies to all persons endowed with New England ideas in regard to the iniquity of Negro slavery.
wow.
So I thought that was pretty significant.
I think so too. And I've been working on the relationship between saints and the slaves, and I'm becoming more and more convinced that we have a very hidden underbelly of abolitionism as a significant hidden factor in our slavery. And now I have archaeological evidence to support that as well. So unfortunately, my article has been rejected, so I'm going to have to find another publisher.
Interesting. And William Smith, later in life, I don't know how much you know kind of the issue around race in the RLDS church. Bill Russell wrote an article about that some time ago, but by the 1890s, Russell says Joseph Smith III had retreated from his position of liberality during the 1860s and 1870s and advocated separating the races in church and establishing separate branches. And William Smith opposes that idea. In fact, he writes to the Saints Herald, and he says the Constitution of these United States makes no distinction in the human family. All men are born free and equal. He quoted the Apostle Paul, God is made of one blood, all nations. By what authority have we the right to say that a colored man has no right to be ordained to all the powers of the priesthood necessary for building up the Church of Christ in any part of the world among any race of people, whether black or white? So
And that
he
is
kind of takes on Joseph Smith III on that. I thought that was interesting. So
that is so interesting, because Joseph III in 1865 had proposed that the Negroes should be ordained, and that people of every culture and race should be ordained to serve their own people.
right,
Well,
yeah. Look at Bill Russell's article on that. He kind of walks through the history of, and then retreating. Then Joseph Smith III kind of retreats from that position in the 1890s a little bit. So
very interesting. Okay, well, our procedure is commonly to let Deb keep people in line, and she sometimes sees those people that are waving their hand and can't find the button but down in that reactions button, there's a place to raise your hand. If you can't get that operational and can get your other hand to wave, then Deb will keep people in order to give us an orderly queue as we ask questions. Proceed, Deb.
Thanks, Paul. Wednesday, you're first, and then Val, and then we'll take care of a couple questions in the chat. Go ahead, Wednesday.
Well, first I'd like to thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting. And on the note of it being Joseph Smith the third walking back from that, I think it's important to note that in the Revelation, like, he does say to their own race, he does put in that precedent for segregation, like initially. And I think there might have been pressure for it to be that way, but also maybe a bit of his personal opinion. Now that we're knowing that, maybe that was also a bit of his personal opinion. So that's thank you for sharing that. I did some research, and I wrote an article surrounding 116, and that's, like, I guess, adding to my knowledge there. I appreciate that. So I was wondering about relationships with other siblings, since you mentioned his strong abolitionist sense and how that's prevalent in the family. I know that Julia Murdoch Smith, she married into a family that was participating in slavery. And I know it caused some conflict between her and Joseph III. So do you know how it might have been with William?
that which part? What do you mean with William? On which part?
His relationship with Julia.
I don't know. I don't have anything on that. I don't think he stayed really close to the family. The sisters did. The three Smith sisters stayed close to Emma, but William is not very close. He's not coming down to Illinois very often.
Okay, got it.
Document maybe once or twice where he comes down, he preaches in Hancock County later, but I don't think they stayed very close. And so I don't have anything on that.
Yeah, thank you.
And what was your article you wrote Wednesday?
It was on Doctrine and Covenants 116, a bit about the history of it, maybe why it was written the way it was, the progressive part of it, and some of the segregation that came from it, and then my position on why it should remain in the Doctrine and Covenants.
Have you published that?
Only online. I sent it to the Herald, but I guess the other side maybe didn't get a chance to put something in, so it didn't go. So it would need to be rewritten, because I do give like a bit of a testimony in there at one point, but no, I haven't tried to publish. I only have self-published it.
I'd love to see it if you're willing to share.
Oh yeah, I'll be happy to. I'll shoot it to you in the chat.
Thank you.
No problem.
Okay. Val, go ahead, please.
Hi, thanks for the presentation again, very interesting. I just have two quick questions. One is, you mentioned that he sort of started preaching plural marriage before it was much announced, and then later he blew up his church with plural marriage. Did he actually contract plural wives?
Did he what?
Did he marry more than one woman at the same time?
Yes, he married as early as 1843. He married, I think it was Priscilla Morgridge in Nauvoo before he left for the East. So he was introduced to that in Nauvoo. So that's where he's getting his ceremony from that he's using in the East and introducing that. And he includes George J. Adams and Samuel Brannan with that. And Sam Brannan kind of gets in trouble with participating in plural marriage once that's discovered in 1845, and we'll have to account to leaders in Nauvoo about that. And so does William when he returns to Nauvoo.
What happened to his the women that he was married to? How did the relationships proceed? Did he abandon them? Did they abandon him?
Yeah, there's some testimony in the temple lawsuit of his wives that when he left Nauvoo, so when he flees September 1845, they felt like he had abandoned them. And so they considered themselves divorced from him once he left Nauvoo.
And that the other question is, you mentioned that he lived sometime as a respected citizen in Northeast Iowa, I think it was.
That's right.
How did he make his living during that time?
He farmed. I don't think he was very successful. I think he endured poverty. In fact, he has this preaching episode when an anti-Mormon preacher comes to town in their rural town of Elkader. And little did he know William Smith was in the audience that day when he preached his anti-Mormon sermon. And William stands up in the audience and says, "I'd like to respond to this. That's my brother you're talking about. And I know more about the family than you do." And so the citizens buy him a suit of clothes, and he preaches a very successful sermon 2 days later, and brought down the house, they said, with the sermon. So, but it indicates to me that you know, that he was fairly poor where they lived. I found some letters to RLDS leadership where he's asking for money, and said that he had to burn his fence down to provide wood enough to get through the winter. And so I think he's pretty poor up there in northeastern Iowa.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Val. There's a couple questions in the chat. Trevor's sharing that coming as an outsider, he's got a couple questions. Where is the discernment from Joseph Smith Jr. by putting William as an apostle when he clearly did so many things in conflict of what Joseph did not want, such as performing marriages and continual trouble with the other apostles? William joined and or approved of different groups, such as Strang and Lyman White. However, he later would leave or not associate with them. And if it was part of any Latter-day Saint group, how can I know that the leaders are speaking the truth if they are later found to be unfaithful or untrustworthy? Isn't God supposed to be speaking through these apostles?
Yeah.
Anybody care to respond to that one?
That's a lengthy question, but yeah, I mean, William had a lot of success. Like I said, you know, I guess none of us are immune from my perspective of falling away necessarily, or letting some of our passions override, you know, our good intentions. And William did a lot of good, made a lot of converts. And I think, you know, sometimes I think there's accounts that are left of William Smith that just makes him look like a rascal. You know, he's kind of written off by the Latter-day Saints, the Salt Lake persuasion, and I think it minimizes his contributions because he did a lot and had a lot of success. Yes, I think he got sidetracked and had some real challenges with his personality. When Joseph and him go through that conflict, William says at one point, he says, "Why don't you just release me from my calling as an apostle?" And Joseph Smith says, "No, you need to rise up and overcome your passions," in a letter he wrote to his brother. "And I'll pray for you that you can overcome these challenges." I think Joseph recognized his temper, recognized the challenges of his personality, but also saw a lot of good in what he was accomplishing and his potential. I mean, there's others like that. You could say that as well. William McClellan might be another example of that, of great talent, very bright. John Boynton, another one. And so, you know, he's a complex personality, I think, had challenges. So.
Okay, one other question in the chat, and then we'll get back to folks with their hands. This is from Rick. Was it known that Joseph Ball was black? Paul Reeve seems to believe that Ball passed as white, and it wasn't known that Ball was black.
Yeah, I think I've read Paul Reeve's material on that. And I think he documents that. Have you seen, I think he's got a new little book, Paul Reeve on race and the priesthood. That's pretty interesting. I think that has the latest research on some of that. I'll have to look at it again and see what he has to say. So on that, but I think he includes them in some of the earliest Black saints in the church.
Kyle, I'll just follow up if I could,
Yeah.
because this has been a big argument between me and Paul. So this is a very important question to me.
Okay.
Paul says, according to the census records, that Ball always passed as white. And so he makes the case that it wasn't known that he was Black. And because I know you said he was the first high priest, and I know Connell O'Donovan has said that as well.
Yeah.
And so that's why if he was Black, because you talked about some of the abolitionist sentiment too,
Yes.
because Connell believes Ball was openly Black, because clearly his father was from Jamaica. Paul thinks maybe his father was mixed race. And anyway, so that's why I asked that question, because to me, it's a very important question, because I want to include him as one of the first Black priesthood holders, but Paul's like, well, he passed as white. So do you have any more information?
No, I don't. I would defer to Paul probably on that.
Okay.
He's done a lot more research than I have. Connell's research is interesting too, though, on that. I think he published an article on that, but I'm sure Paul's looked at all that.
Well, yeah, because Connell's done the genealogy, and clearly his father was Black from Jamaica, but
Yeah.
Paul says he passed as white. So
Interesting.
Shane, go ahead, and then Monty.
Yes, by any chance, do you have a book coming out about the life of William Smith? Or if not, are there any books on the subject that you can recommend?
Yeah, this is my book. It's been published for a few years now.
Oh,
Greg Cofford Books did it. So you can find it on Amazon or,
all right.
yeah.
And I recommend it very highly.
Thanks, Paul.
Okay. Monty, go ahead, please. Monty, were you ready? Monty's maybe frozen. We'll come back to Monty. Jerry Grover, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I signed in a little bit late. Maybe you talked about this, but I was wondering if you had any more information about kind of the physical confrontation that was had with Joseph Smith and William. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a recounting, but I don't know what was the genesis of all that.
Yeah, I have a whole chapter on that in the book, but yeah, they disagreed. I think it was there was a case and they were both giving testimony. And I think William felt like Joseph was undermining his testimony. They kind of worked it out, but later that evening they started to hear testimony again. And Joseph said, I think Lucy Mack Smith was talking, their mother. And Joseph said, you're giving testimony that's already been heard. We've already heard this account. And I think William was still fuming from the previous meeting. And so he comes, lunges at Joseph, and Joseph said he was trying to get his overcoat off and couldn't get it off in time. And William begins to thrash him there and hurts him pretty significantly. I think there's one account that says he might have re-injured his side from the tar and feathering incident during that tussle with William. And
So
William, go ahead.
When you say it was a case, meaning what?
Like a church case on members of the church, like a church trial, if you will.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so they're participating in that, like as the High Council is meeting, discussing this case on membership of a church member. I think it was over a case of abuse by parents towards a child.
Yeah, just my great-great-grandfather was on the Kirtland High Council, so I was wondering about that.
Oh, what's the name?
Thomas Grover.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so I just hadn't heard anything through the family, so I'm just curious.
Yeah, you could look at the Kirtland High Council minute book, see if he was there then.
Yeah.
Okay. James Lucas, go ahead, please.
I have a couple of questions, maybe three, on different points. Obviously, maybe this is all in your book and I should just go look at your book, but this is easier. First question is, William Smith is, there's a quote from him or a writing from him relatively late, I think in the 1890s, which would put it only, close to the time of his passing, where he describes the translation of the Book of Mormon. And he's one of the people who ascribes it to Joseph using a stone in a hat. Now, he would have been just a teenager at the time that the translation was actually occurring. And so my question is, first question is, did he ever, is there any contemporary evidence from the 1820s of him being present either in Fayette or Harmony for the translation, when the translation was actually occurring? And did he otherwise, other than that very late account from the 1890s, I guess shortly before his death, were there any other accounts where he talked about the translation of the Book of Mormon that you're aware of?
Yeah, I think there are other accounts besides that one. Well, he would have been present with, I guess, with Martin Harris, right, in Palmyra for a time. Is that right?
Well, no, because the Martin Harris went to Harmony
That's
to
right.
work on his
That's
work on the translation,
Yeah.
and I don't recall that William went down and joined
No,
Joseph and
I don't
Emma.
think he's there in Harmony or Fayette, although it's possible maybe at Fayette. But some of his recollections, which I wrote an article on the Smith family recollections of the first vision. I want to do a follow-up article on the Smith family recollections of the Book of Mormon, coming forth of the Book of Mormon. Some of William's accounts appear to have come from some of Joseph Smith sharing things in the 1830s too, which I think is interesting. So, for instance, some of the accounts of the first vision were things that Joseph was sharing in Kirtland with some of the Quorum of the 12 and in Nauvoo. So it's possible that some of that information could have come from that time period, as well as 1820s possibly, when he's sharing some of that with the family perhaps. But being present, no, although he gives the most detailed description of the Urim and Thummim that we have, describing it in detail, shape. He also gives, he leaves a recollection of the weight of the Book of Mormon plates, 60 pounds, so we have some of those accounts that William Smith is leaving. That's different than the translation, but.
Okay. Second question on a wholly different topic. I have to bring it up. I'm fascinated by him sneaking off to join the army in the Civil War.
Yeah.
Can you just quickly give very quick details about, was he in an Iowa regiment? Did he engage in any combat? How long was his service? Just, the basic facts on that.
Yeah, he joins an Illinois regiment down at Rock Island, Illinois. And I think, I'm trying to remember the years exactly. I think it's 1863, so it's a little later. Probably only serves about a year total. I think he comes home for a time, got really sick down in Arkansas, so he comes home for a time. Some of it might have been financial as well. I think there was, I can't remember the amount of money I talk about in the book that the soldiers were receiving at that time. But he does misstate his age because he would have been ineligible, but that wasn't that uncommon to misstate your age when you were too young or too old if you wanted to fight in the war. And so, serves for about a year. It's really cool when he comes back. he eventually seeking a pension, Civil War pension.
Right. That's always
So
a
he's-
good source of history,
Yeah.
the pension records.
But,
Yeah.
but the doctors are evaluating him. I mean, how often do you get doctors' records from the 19th century?
Oh,
And
wow.
in several of these evaluations, they use these words that almost describe a depression, mood. They talk about his mood some, and mood is tepid. Some different kinds of terms that we might not use today, but I found that very fascinating as a trained mental health professional. That, man, those are pretty neat records that are pretty rare that you'd get from the 19th century doctor's records. But anyway, he does get a pension and for his service. And I think who was saying they've been to his grave up in Osterdock. He's got the GAR, excuse me, that's there by the grave
Okay.
for his Civil War service and some of that. So
Now, just one last question. You say he joined an Illinois regiment. Was it the same one that Joseph III and Alexander served in, or was it unconnected to their Civil War service?
no, he's got a nephew that joins down in Quincy. Catherine's son joins down in Quincy, Illinois, and serves for a full 3 years around the same time.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much.
You bet.
Thanks, James. Okay, Paul, then Monty.
Let me respond to James Lucas' comment there. I don't think Joseph III joined. He gave a speech supporting it and then later regretted that. And Alexander did serve briefly, but I don't believe Joseph Smith III did. I'd like to go back to the tepid, what did you call it? The
Tepid.
turbulent summer. If I recall correctly, and it's been a year or more since I read your book, I remember being struck by the fact, because my wife had to deal with edema as well. And I think you indicated that Catherine had lost 50 gallons of fluid in the previous year.
Caroline, his wife, Caroline. Yeah.
Caroline, right.
Yes, she had been tapped. I can't remember what I said in there, 20 times. And that's why she went to the east with him, was to see if she could get better medical care on the eastern coast. But she really couldn't. And she dies fairly young in Nauvoo, barely makes it back to Nauvoo. And
Just a couple of days. Okay, well, my other question is a little bit more crucial, I think, relative to relationships, because according to what I have found about the Hodges brothers, William was an advocate for the Hodges brothers, and clearly that put him at odds with Brigham.
Yeah, and other leaders as well. He in the book, it was kind of interesting that I found that William, if I remember right, William baptized some of the Hodges back in Erie County, Pennsylvania.
Right.
And so he had a long history with the Hodges. He was their missionary and baptized them. So I think he had a long history relationship there. Bill Shepard's done some research on that as well.
Okay.
With the Hodges. But yeah, he's clashing with a lot of folks in Nauvoo, a lot of the leadership. I think he's pretty upset about his role being reined in, his authority being reined in Nauvoo. And he's pretty mad. I mean, you get some notes to the Times and Seasons. They were going to insert a little tidbit about him going east and doing patriarchal blessings for the saints in the east. And then the Quorum of the 12 thought better of that and said, I don't think we want to put him back in the east. And so they canceled that mission, and he's really upset that they canceled that mission. But the 12 also took care of William. I mean, they allowed him, he was charging for his patriarchal blessings. They provided a home for William and Catherine and Lucy Mack Smith. They're basically supporting the Smith family in Nauvoo. They deed property to the three Smith sisters so that they have property. The Millikens, that's William's sister, Lucy Milliken, daughter Lucy, ends up with the home, the Joseph B. Noble home in Nauvoo, outright, free and clear. They gift her that home. to Lucy Mack Smith, and then she gives it to her daughter, Lucy Milliken. So
But
William had it pretty good. I think if he'd have stayed at Nauvoo, he'd have been provided for, but once he leaves, he struggles financially the rest of his life.
I have him at the Mansion House for a while,
Yeah,
and then at William Marks' house for a while.
yeah, they're all in the Marks house for a time. Yep.
What provision did the Quorum of 12 provide him?
They provided, they allowed him to charge. Nobody else had charged for patriarchal blessing that I'm aware of. Hiram wasn't charging for patriarchal blessings. I wrote an article on it in the John Whitmer Historical Journal of how much property they gave to the Smith family. So I know that Emma and Brigham tussled over that, and that was a point of contention. But yeah, and I talk about a little bit in the book as well about how much William's provided for. William had more, the Quorum of the 12 say that William had more support from the bishop's storehouse than any other member of the Quorum of the 12. And they're resentful of that how much he's taking each month from the bishop's storehouse.
Well, let me second your comments about Bill Shepard having written about the Hodges. I think that his article about William is one of the most instructive that's been written. And so if he cares to comment, I'd certainly encourage that. But let's go to the hands.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Monty, go ahead, and then Carol. Go ahead, Monty.
This is regarding, you were talking about the communication between William Smith and Mr. Strang.
Uh-huh.
And I was wondering if there's any record of his correspondence having any significance whatsoever in the doctrine of the Strangites later on.
Possibly. I don't know what you think, Bill, on that. You know, I'm sure William shared a number of things. George J. Adams is affiliating with Strang as well. And so maybe some influence on plural marriage there a little bit. What's your thoughts, Bill?
I'm not sure, really. As you know, Strang denies that there is very much against the plural marriage to start with. For a couple of years, enters plural marriage. The William Smith period with Strang is really strange. William comes up here to live, and he is cut off from the Strangites due to an illicit affair that was testified to. But prior to this, he is saying glorious things about Strang, you know, that he knows he's the prophet, the family. He probably forges the sisters' names to documents. But once he is cut off from the Strangites for that sexual liaison, boy, you've never seen anybody any more bitter than William Smith. He's a totally different person. So he's hard to figure out.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. That pretty well answers my question.
Yeah.
Thanks,
I think
Monty.
it's ultimately George J. Adams that seals Strang's plural wife, isn't it, Bill Shepard? And so William Smith had a lot of influence on George J. Adams, I think, earlier. So
Okay. Carol, go ahead, and then Jerry.
Thank you for your presentation, first of all. Am I coming through? Can you hear me?
yes.
I had 3 brief comments. One, according to Wikipedia, William Smith had 5 wives. Do you know anything more about the 3 that weren't mentioned?
Yeah, I've got an appendix in my book that documents all of the plural wives there. He married sisters in the East, the Libby sisters, Hannah and Sarah Libby. Priscilla Mortgage, I think there's a Stain, yeah, Priscilla Mortgage Stains. Anyway, I've got them documented in my appendix that we can document all of those sealings.
So there were 5.
Yeah, there's at least 5. There may be more than 5.
And the other thing, you said he moved to Galena, where he was a farmer. And so
moved
often Galena,
He moved to, he published that expose, that pamphlet in Galena. So he went up there and he published that and sent them to all the newspapers, but he settles in Elkader, Iowa.
you
Further
said that he
north.
was a poor farmer. Galena is, I think, French or something for lead. It was a lead mine town. I'm not far from it. And
Yeah, he
as
didn't
soon as the
live-
lead mine,
He didn't live in Galena, but he did go there for a time and published that, but he lives up in Elkader. That's where he farms, is Elkader, Iowa, which isn't too far away from you.
that's right.
Yeah.
And then I had a question about this picture that you showed.
Yes,
Is this him? Or,
I believe it is. Yeah, I believe it is William Smith.
okay, it doesn't say anything in the book about it being William Smith or
No.
his wife. It just says man sitting. How did you come to the conclusion that it is William Smith?
Well, he painted all the Smiths there. It's just subjective, but it looks a lot like one of his pictures about 20 years later. He has gray hair then, but he has a profile picture that's very similar to that painting. And so it's not definitive, but I believe that it is a painting. Sutcliffe Maudsley was very close to the Smith family. If you look at those pictures in that book, if you have Stephen Buell's book there, is that what you're looking in?
No, I'm Sutcliffe Maudsley.
Yeah, that's Stephen Buell's book.
Yeah.
And just look how many Smiths are in there. He was there at the time he was doing those paintings. So, it's a companion piece to that other one that they're showing on the other page there. So I believe that's William and Caroline, his wife that died of dropsy.
I get, Maudsley is buried about 10 miles away from me too. So interesting. Thank you.
Mackinac. He's my direct ancestor, Sutcliffe Maudsley.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah.
Makokada. Yes.
Is that how you say it? Say it again. I want to hear.
Makokada.
Well, that's hard.
I believe it means little bear in Native American or something. They change it all the time. Makokada. Thank you.
Go there, see the graves.
Okay, thanks, Carol. Jerry and then Rick. Go ahead, please, Jerry.
Yeah, just a little follow-up to James's question. It seemed like William Smith gave a very specific, description of how the breastplates and the urim and thumb were attached to them and how they were utilized. Almost, and it flipped up and there was a pocket. That's why I want to actually maybe see it, on the breastplates and that. It's almost like too specific to have been like some recounting,
Right,
And
yeah. And Lucy Mack Smith gives a description too that's pretty detailed. I think she says that she felt them through a handkerchief or something, doesn't she, in her history? So I guess that could have been the case with William as well, but maybe they were able to handle those and hold those. It almost sounds like that, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, because it says that, the rod flipped up and then you attach the, the spectacle through it, and there's and it flipped down, there's a little pocket on and then on the breastplate.
Yeah, like it had a post or something that went into the breastplate. That's what it almost sounds like.
Yeah, and then they described it as concave, not how it's really represented,
Right.
It's not, And then the other thing, at another time, maybe it was that same I can't remember that late interview, where he mentioned that the plates he thought were made of copper, which is probably the only one I've heard that has indicated that, other than Josiah Stoll said they had a green cast on the corner, when they went through the window. So yeah, it's kind of interesting that if he's recounting somebody else, he's the only one. It seems like there's nobody else recounting those things, that I've found. So that's why I wonder if he maybe did see at least the breastplates. But I don't know. Maybe you haven't uncovered any more information.
No, but I have all the accounts of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon and kind of a spreadsheet that I put together from William Smith, but nothing on the material for sure.
Yeah, I just did a book on the metallurgy of the plates and stuff like that. So that was always curious to me. That his description seemed to be just like way more specific than anybody else. So
Okay, thanks, Jerry. Rick, go ahead, and then James. Are you there, Rick?
Took me a second to unmute. Sorry about that.
Oh.
So I hate to do this in front of Bill Shepard, but I had a conversation with Bill one time, and he said that he had a hard time liking William Smith. And I was
No.
just wondering if you had that same feeling, Kyle.
Yeah, he's difficult. I mean, you know, he's difficult. I guess I'm mixed. There's some, he's just he's a complicated figure. I think that's what drew me to him, is because he's so complex. You know, there's aspects of his personality that are wonderful, and he's a great preacher, and later life he's a great father, even a great stepfather to Eliza's children. Townsfolk speak highly of him up in Elkader. His children speak very highly of him, and yet, you know, very difficult, manipulative. With plural marriage, he was manipulative with some of the women. You know, it's that those aspects are very difficult. I think he was difficult with Joseph at times, and leadership. So I guess mixed.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, James, go ahead, and then Chris.
Two other quick questions. One is, part of his career in the East was he was the publisher of the Prophet, right? Wasn't that the
Yeah.
newspaper he edited? Did this is real trivia, but did you know where he lived when he was publishing that newspaper in New York? Did he live in New York City? And do we have any information about where he lived?
I think he had a lot of help with the hands-on day-to-day newspaper, because he's traveling around quite a bit too. But maybe he's overseeing that, kind of like Joseph oversaw the times and seasons, but oftentimes had very little to do with probably the details of that publication, with all the other things he had to do. So he's in New York at times. He's in Bordentown, New Jersey. He's living in New Jersey for a time. Spends quite a bit of time in New Jersey when he's there. That's kind of his home for a lot of his time in the East, was in New Jersey.
Oh, okay.
But I think he's going there often.
Was he more hands-on when he was the editor of the Wasp, when he went back to Nauvoo?
Well, I think he is, but I think he had a lot of help from W.W. Phelps. Bruce Van Orden could probably comment on that. He's talked about some things there that he thinks W.W. Phelps had a heavy voice in a lot of that newspaper, the Wasp. And I don't know, I see William Smith in there too, but he thinks W.W. Phelps can be pretty brash too. So they're both kind of tussling with Thomas Sharp and his Warsaw Signal. And eventually Joseph received some letters from people outside of Nauvoo saying, I don't think the Wasp is the best name for a newspaper if you're trying to make peace with your neighbors. And so guess what they rename it? They eventually rename it the Nauvoo Neighbor. John Taylor takes over editorship, and it takes on a much softer tone after that time.
Bit more of a diplomat.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, James. Go ahead, Chris, and then Paul. Oops, you're muted, Chris.
Thanks, Deb.
Yeah.
Kyle, thanks for your presentation.
You're welcome.
It's William Smith is a very fascinating person to me. And I don't know a whole lot about Smith. I've read several things and haven't unfortunately made it to your volume. So my question may be very uninformed. I know about things like capitalization and that sort of thing in the Book of Mormon. So I may be way out of my depth here. But there are a couple of things that struck me over the years, and just read Dan Vogel's sections on Smith, William Smith and Joseph, their relationship. It's always struck me that and this is an outsider's kind of question, always struck me that William had a sense of entitlement when it came to appointments and position, etc. And it also has been my impression that one of the goals that Joseph had was to kind of redeem his family in the kind of conflict that may have been there, or certainly their differences on religious views, etc.
Mhm.
How, given that those kind of observations, does that have anything to do you think, with why Joseph seems to have been so long suffering with William? You mentioned that, after the big fight, that he kind of refuses to let him go,
Mhm.
almost as an act of sanctification, if you will. And so can you think out loud with me about that? Do you think that figures in to his decision to have him serve as an apostle?
Maybe. Yeah, I mean, there's this experience with Don Carlos Smith. Don Carlos Smith is the youngest Smith brother. At age 19, Joseph is putting him in as the president of the high priests in Kirtland. And as he's preparing to do that, there's some discussion about that, probably due to his age. And according to one journal account, Joseph says, "It was given to my family to preside over the quorums of the priesthood." And that kind of ended the discussion. And Don Carlos Smith is put in basically as kind of a stake president of the high priests in Kirtland. That's an interesting comment, right? I mean, I'm piggybacking on what you're saying about William and being put into the quorum of the 12. Perhaps, I think Joseph's family is very important to him, that they be unified. And it is really remarkable when you think about it. I've written about the whole Smith family, that every single one of them follows Joseph Smith to Kirtland, to Missouri, to Nauvoo, including spouses, every single one of them. And as they're kind of ostracized in Palmyra from the community, as the Book of Mormon's coming forth, who does he have? I mean, he's got Martin Harris and Oliver Cowdery, but basically he has his family. His family is his greatest supporters during that time, which I think was very difficult for him. And so there seemed to be some real loyalty to family. And I think some specialness with the Smith family. You mentioned entitlement a little bit. You pick that up in later letters too. That we're the Smith family and we're of the royal blood. You pick that up in letters. And even Catherine, in some of her letters to leaders of the RLDS Church and to the LDS Church, she wrote to both leaders, and you pick that up a little bit. That there's some specialness, there's some entitlement. I think they felt entitled to monies around scriptures, things like that, because of the sacrifices Joseph Smith made. Maybe that's getting off topic to your question, but just kind of interesting that there's that sentiment that runs through the family a little bit. And the saints felt they were special, right? Lucy Mack Smith is treated with a lot of reverence at the October 1845 General Conference, where she speaks in General Conference. That's pretty unheard of. Catherine speaks in General Conference in the RLDS Church, 1895. More than once, which is pretty unusual.
Thanks for that, Kyle.
Yeah,
I appreciate it very much.
Yeah.
Okay, Paul, and then Wanda, please. Paul?
I happen to be one of those people that seem to like William Smith. And that I recognize that's already been portrayed as something difficult to do. But I also have been a younger brother. I find myself sympathizing with him a great deal, particularly in the sense that with all of his other brothers dead and him
Yeah.
the sole survivor,
Yeah,
look at what a difficult situation he faced in life. And I appreciate that even though I didn't like his choosing to support Brigham Young as much as he did, to join the polygamy issue, but the fact that he was egalitarian relative to the races, and the fact that one of the things out of your book that I really appreciated was the testimony that he offered in 1886, if I remember correctly, at the Kirtland Temple.
mhm.
Perhaps you could remind us of that.
Yeah, was it 1883? I think it was at that
1883.
Kirtland reunion for the earliest church. He's there.
Okay, I thought it was the 50th anniversary of the Kirtland Temple dedication is what I remembered, but
Could have been. He went there several times, but
well,
yeah, it kind of talks about working on the temple and the sacrifices that he made.
Right.
and- Yeah, yeah.
the testimony, if I recall the testimony, and it may be that I saw it other than in your book, but I thought it was your book that gave a very, very eloquent account of his testimony and how profoundly moving it was for the other people,
Yeah.
because I think he was the only one still able to share testimony after 50 years who had been there and had witnessed the remarkable experiences of the saints at that time.
Yeah, it was powerful.
Well, again, I appreciate your book has given me more insight into him, and I see that Brian Stubbs has signed off, having also acknowledged he's learning more about William this evening than you do before, more to appreciate. And so I would highlight for people that I think there's an awful lot more about William Smith that we need to learn to appreciate.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everybody. Been
Okay,
good to.
Wanda, and
Any more
then,
questions? Okay.
yeah, we got some more questions. Wanda, and then Bill Shepherd.
I just have a question for you about what it would be like if we could go back or bring William forward to this century and put him in charge of someone to develop a diagnosis for his condition.
Yeah,
And it seems to me, from my experience with other people who have had bipolar, that may have been one of the problems.
yeah, it's always tough to diagnose the dead, right? But there's some elements, that certainly, you could make a case for a few things there that it's just hard, to not have more information. But I think there were some emotional health struggles that were definitely a factor.
I had a friend that worked with me on editing the Unix courses when they first came out at AT&T Network Systems. And he did the editing, but I drove him back and forth, and he had bipolar. And he's told me so many stories about how he would be on a job, and he was a brilliant man, but he would just walk off for no reason. And it seems like William must have walked off a lot of places too, and changed his opinions a lot. And so it just occurred to me that it could possibly have been that kind of a problem.
Yeah, certainly with some anger and things like that too.
And they get angry too sometimes.
Yeah, anger is part of that.
Yeah. That was all.
Thanks, Wanda.
Thanks,
Okay,
Wanda.
Bill Shepherd, go ahead.
Yeah, Kyle and Paul, I have great admiration for Joseph III being able to deal so effectively with William. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. He kind of, it's almost a negotiation as they go back and forth with letters on William wanting a position, wanting the patriarch position, perhaps wanting to be an apostle in the church. I think he wanted both of those positions. And Joseph Smith III never promises them those positions, but he wants to give them all the all the kudos he can of recognizing what he brings to the table, recognizing his experience, recognizing him as a missionary, some of those kinds of things, but he won't give him those positions. I think he knew better than that. But he's very judicious about the way he handles William, and they had a amiable relationship. They, I think it went well. He handled it well. Maybe that was some of his legal training that helped him to be so judicious in the way he handled that. But yeah, I think he kept William in check. He'd have probably had problems if he'd have put him into leadership. It seemed like William never did too well in presiding. I've got a line at the end of my book. Maybe I'll just share with you that's maybe a good conclusion to William Smith. I think it's from a hymn that he quotes in his history that I thought was pretty good. He said, if you cannot be the watchman standing high on Zion's wall, pointing out the path to heaven, offering life and peace to all, with your prayers and with your bounties, you can do what heaven demands. You can be like faithful Aaron, holding up the prophet's hands. And I think William had to learn that lesson the hard way through a lot of life experience, but eventually kind of came to that conclusion in his life.
Well, thank you, Kyle. I very much appreciate your presentation. I do want to ask just on the side, because the Samuel also held up the prophet's hands, and he died under rather curious circumstances. I wonder if in your research on the family, if you can get us any insight into the cause of Samuel's death.
Yeah, at the contemporary sources say it was bilious fever that resulted from his ride to Carthage to try to get to his brothers. In fact, 2 of his children both document that. I think William Smith spreads the rumor later that Samuel was poisoned by order of Brigham Young. And he puts that in newspapers in the 1850s, and he also promotes that within the Smith family as well. And it's during that time period he's kind of tussling with them. And so that's a rumor that's perpetuated throughout the Smith family. Brigham Young wasn't even in Nauvoo when Samuel died. He wasn't back from his mission yet on the East Coast. So he wasn't even present. But he accuses Brigham Young and others of poisoning Samuel Smith. And that, I find that in later sources of a number of the Smith family, a lot of the younger Smith generation, the next generation, Ina Coolbrith, and some others. So anyway, that's one thing I deal with in the book too. I talk about that a little bit. Well, thank you, everyone. Probably been.
Thank you, Kyle.
So
I need to intrude one more, because we're scheduled next week to have me presenting the Hans Mill Hamlet book that was supposed to be out some months ago. We submitted it in middle of May last year. John Whitmer Books has promised us it'll be out any day now for the last several months. And so I went ahead and scheduled it, and now I don't have the book yet. And I'm supposed to be presenting it next week. So if anybody is anxious to present something next week and is available, the slot is open. Otherwise, I'll figure out some way to well, I'd like to have the book on hand to be able to present it, but we can present without that, I suppose. But if there's somebody that has an urgent topic you'd like to share with us, then next week is open all of a sudden. Or possibly it'll be published by then, but we've been told it'll be out any day now for the last 3 months. And we're now 16 months in preparation. I'll be getting back home from Spectacular on Saturday evening. And so if there's any emails regarding that by then, I'd be appreciative. Okay, thank you, Kyle. Thank you all for presenting.
thanks for all your good questions.
Well, I see Bill has, Bill, is that another question for you?
No.
No, we just can't get rid of the little green check mark.
Well then, good night, the Lord is watching o'er you. Good night, his blessings go before you. Good night, and we'll be praying for you. So good night. May God bless you.
You.
Thank you, Bill.